Did you kill Mr. Boz, Miss Trammell?
I'd have to be pretty stupid to write a book about killing and then kill somebody the way I described it in my book. I'd be announcing myself as the killer. I'm not stupid.
We know you're not stupid, Miss Trammell.
Maybe that's what you're counting on to get you off the hook.
Writing the book gives you an alibi.
Yes, it does, doesn't it?
In a world overflowing with movies, we need a hero. Someone to separate the bad from the good.
Hi everyone, I'm Em and welcome to Verbal Diorama episode 167, Basic Instinct. This is the podcast that's all about the history and legacy of movies you know and movies you don't. And as always, a huge hi and welcome to Verbal Diorama to all of you brand new listeners to this podcast. Thank you for being here. Welcome back, regular or irregular returning listeners, whichever you are. Thank you for being here as well. Thank you for choosing this podcast. Because there are a lot of movie podcasts out there. There are a lot of movie podcasts vying for your ears. And no matter how you found this podcast, I'm so happy to have you here for the history and legacy of Basic Instinct. And this episode's going to be quite spicy. This is the first erotic thriller that I've ever done on this podcast. And I'm delighted to welcome, for the first time in a long time, a guest to Verbal Diorama because this month, the month of August, I'm doing something called Auguest because you guys know that I love a bit of a bad pun. And he's someone I've been trying to get on this podcast for a long time. So he and I actually bonded during lockdown. Together, we and a group of like-minded souls watched really bad movies on Amazon Prime. This is a man who can wield an ice pick like no other. A man who likes rough edges. And a podcaster who falls for the wrong guest appearance. It's Gali from the Rewind Movie Podcast. Hi, Gali.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Em. How are you doing? Thanks for...
Hi.
I much prefer to be compared to Catherine than old Shooter Curran, who, God bless him, not the best detective in the world, is he? So, no, thank you for that. That's lovely.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, you know, I kind of figured that you might like a very interestingly kind of basic instincty introduction because this was a movie that you chose to do on Verbal Diorama. For everyone listening, it would be a really good opportunity to kind of say a little bit about yourself because I know who you are, but maybe some of the listeners don't know who you are. So tell them a little bit about yourself and a little bit about the Rewind Movie Podcast.
I will do. Thanks, Em. Hello, everyone. My name is Gali. I'm one of the co-hosts of the Rewind Movie Podcast, an award-winning film podcast. Yes, my God. Where former film students and industry insiders have in-depth discussions about films that shaped their passion for cinema whilst trying to reappraise them from a 2022 perspective. And that changes every year, Em, by the way. So, you know, when we started, it was 2018, and now we're in 2022. Madness, isn't it? I was born in Stoke-on-Trent. I may as well go through the whole gambit, right, Em? They may as well know my entire life. So I was born...
Yeah, literally start when you were born and then up to now. We've got plenty of time.
Fantastic. So, yep, I was born in Stoke-on-Trent. My parents are Italian and Greek, but I was born in Stoke-on-Trent. But, you know, if you could put a symbol in there, that'd be great. I went and studied film in Leeds, and then I worked in film and television for a few years. I left the industry for reasons, mainly down to the fact that London is really expensive to live in. And yeah, so I had to kind of leave it. But then starting the podcast was like a way of kind of having that creative outlet. And ever since then, I've managed to, get the gang involved who like I say, most of them still work in the industry. And then I get guests, and we've had you on the podcast. You did Super Mario Brothers, which I
did. That
was an interesting discussion. But
it always is with me, isn't
Absolutely.
it? Let's be
and
honest.
And we bonded over Twitter, which is, it's one of those things, isn't it? Normally a sash pool of hate and despair, but every now and again you get a crumb of golden goodness. And that was one of them, wasn't it? Our friendship was formed out of just I don't even remember. Did I? I think you added us to the Film Stories podcast recommendations, and then we just kind of struck it good.
Just like, I don't know, it was just like finding that, like, with all of you guys at the Rewind Movie Podcast, it's just been like literally like finding a connection.
Yeah.
With like all of you, because you're all really cool guys and you're all really knowledgeable as well about like film history and stuff like that. And I think that's why I love your podcast so much, is that you do obviously talk a little bit about the history but it's mainly about how that movie kind of transcends sort of through your experiences of watching it like when you were younger, sort of to like watching it now. And honestly, your podcast is still one of my favorites, still like constantly on my rotation. So I have genuinely been trying to get you on for such a long time, and it's just been, you've been busy, I've been busy, but I've finally managed to do it now. And obviously your choice was Basic Instinct, and we can obviously talk about the reasons why that was your choice and what your history is with that. But before we do, what I'll do is let's have a listen to the trailer for Basic Instinct.
So we got 31 stab wounds.
What was it?
Ice pick.
I'd like to speak to Miss Catherine Trammell, please.
Is she a suspect?
She's a writer. She published a novel. It's about a retired rock and roll star who gets murdered by his girlfriend.
You know how she does the boyfriend? With an ice pick.
She intended the book to be her alibi.
You didn't feel anything for him. You just had sex with him for your book.
In the beginning, he gave me a lot of pleasure.
You like playing games?
Games are fun.
What's your new book about?
A detective, he falls for the wrong woman.
What happens?
She kills him. How's it feel to kill someone?
You tell me.
You're in over your head.
She seduces people. She manipulates people. She's evil!
Freeze!
I have nothing to hide.
You playing a game here?
Games are over.
After her rock star boyfriend is murdered exactly how she described in her best-selling novel, clever and manipulative Catherine Trammell is brought in by detectives for questioning, but she is seemingly fascinated by Detective Nick Curran. He likewise becomes obsessed with Catherine and is convinced she killed her boyfriend, but the lust-filled cat and mouse game they start playing has consequences. They end up sleeping together, which enrages Catherine's lover Roxy, who tries to kill Nick. Then contradicting evidence becomes apparent. Maybe Catherine isn't guilty after all. Okay, let's quickly run through the cast. Michael Douglas as Detective Nick Curran, Sharon Stone as Catherine Trammell, George Zunza as Detective Gus Moran, Jean Triplehorn as Dr. Beth Garner, Dennis Arndt as Lieutenant Philip Walker, and Leilani Sorrell as Roxy Harding. Basic Instinct was written by Joe Esterhaus and directed by Paul Verhoeven. So let's go through a quick production history of Basic Instinct. Joe Esterhaus sold the spec script for Basic Instinct. It took him 13 days to write. He sold this for $3 million in 1990 and it was purchased by Mario Kassar at Carolco. Esterhaus had worked as a police reporter for Cleveland's The Plain Dealer before becoming a screenwriter, and he modelled Nick Curran after a cop who simply enjoyed the excitement too much and was constantly involved in shootings. On one level, he was a brilliant cop, but you had the sneaking suspicion that he enjoyed his job too much. Catherine Trammell is also derived from a real person, this time a go-go dancer from Dayton, Ohio, and one evening Esterhaus picked this person up and they basically had a very fun-filled conversation in his hotel room, upon which she pulled a gun on him. She ended up putting the gun down after a lengthy conversation with him, and essentially he saw a really smart, really gutsy woman who was doing whatever she needed to do to survive. And so both of the main characters in Basic Instinct come from these two random real-life characters. Michael Douglas would be paid $15 million to star in the film, and he wanted a fellow A-list actress to work on the film with him to share some of the burden of the film. He suggested Kim Basinger for the role of Catherine Trammell, but she turned down the offer. He also suggested Meg Ryan, Greta Skarkey and Julia Roberts, but all of them declined as well. Michelle Pfeiffer, Gina Davis, Kathleen Turner, Kelly Lynch, Ellen Barkin and Mariel Hemingway also all declined the role. Sharon Stone, who was ultimately chosen for the part, she'd previously collaborated with Verhoeven on Total Recall, but had been a relative unknown before the success of this movie. Stone referenced Kathleen Turner in Body Heat and Barbara Stanwyck in Double Indemnity as her inspirations for the role of Catherine Trammell, and while Michael Douglas got his $15 million, she received a mere $500,000 for the role. Now, Joe Esterhaus and Paul Verhoeven, they came to blows with regards to the script for the movie, and Esterhaus thought that Verhoeven was compromising his story. So there were some revisions proposed by Verhoeven, one of which contained a lesbian sex scene, and Esterhaus deemed this exploitative. So he and producer Irwin Winkler left the production after Verhoeven refused to compromise. On Verhoeven's recommendation, Gary Goldman was subsequently hired to rewrite the script a further 4 times. Verhoeven said his plans were undramatic and really stupid following the 4th revision. And so he called Esterhaus a few months later, and they decided to go back to Esterhaus's original version of the script. And Verhoeven not only revised it back to Esterhaus's initial script, but also organised a news conference in support of it. So by the 5th version of this script, it had completely reverted back to Esterhaus's original script with only minor dialogue and visual alterations. For the movie, despite Goldman's work, Joe Esterhaus is credited as the only writer. This movie is rated R in the US and 18 here in the UK, but it was originally given an NC-17 rating for graphic depictions of extremely explicit violence, sexual content and strong language. Under pressure from TriStar and Carolco, Verhoeven cut 35 to 40 seconds of the movie to gain that required R rating. Basic Instinct would go on to gross $352.9 million worldwide against a $49 million production budget, making it the 9th highest grossing domestic film of 1992. It has been copied, parodied and referenced multiple times over the years since its release 30 years ago. So, Gali, when you had a choice of... You literally had a choice of any movie in the whole entire world.
Any film.
Because
any film.
They gave you
I could have picked anything.
Literally anything. And technically, you did pick something else first, and then you did change your mind. Originally, your choice was AI, artificial intelligence. And then you changed your mind to Basic Instinct. So, I guess my question to you is, why? And how? And what?
Well, firstly, I think AI, artificial intelligence, is a fantastic film. I don't know, is that a controversial opinion? I'm not sure. I know that there's, super Kubrick fans out there who believe that Spielberg ruined it and made it melodramatic and whatnot. But I genuinely think that the dystopian sci-fi era that Spielberg went through is his best era. That might be controversial to some listeners. But then I thought to myself, you know what? Because I'm a big fan of your show. I think you are one of the most giving podcasters out there, but not just that sounds like kind of underhand compliment, but genuinely but in a genuine way, your show is so well researched. If you want to know something about a movie and you also want to feel the thing that you can't feel when you go and research these things yourself, which is the passion, the love and the enthusiasm, then your show is just like a must. So for me, it is a must. Every time that you do a film that I've never seen or haven't seen for a while, I'm absolutely listening in, because then you'll just pique my interest. I looked at your catalogue and thought, you know what, you're missing the BBFC certification of 18 plus. Not that you haven't done adult movies, but genuinely that makes it sound like this is reductive. But I think that Basic Instinct is something that I'm attracted to movies that not only are fantastic, technically, but also encourage discussion. And I think Basic Instinct is exactly that. Rightly or wrongly, whether or not you think this movie is a good movie or a bad movie, you don't walk out of this and forget about it 5 minutes after. You definitely have a discussion.
True.
So I just thought, you know what? I really want to have a chat with you about this movie because I knew that this was out your wheelhouse and I'm genuinely interested. Like, we're a podcast that unfortunately is for dudes. I wish we're going to get you back on the show, but your perspective is something that we gravely miss. So that's why I thought, you know what, we'll do Basic Instinct because we've covered it on the show, but we never got that female perspective. So I'm interested in know what you think, as well as me trying to sell it to you and your listeners, I guess.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing because you're right. I would probably not choose to cover a movie like this on a normal episode. And I guess the main reason for that is not that it's not got a very interesting history, because I think it has, but it would just be something that I just wouldn't even consider. I wouldn't even think about. Because admittedly, I do lean towards movies that I really like or that I, think that deserve a little bit more of a critical reappraisal or something like this. Whereas a movie like Basic Instinct, to me, this is like the wheelhouse of 90s erotic thrillers. This is like the 90s erotic thriller that everyone knows, everyone talks about. Every other movie that came out after it wanted to be this movie. And I think for me, I thought, well, maybe loads of people have talked about this. I had a quick look because I was like, I wonder the podcasts that I'm aware of, how many of them have actually talked about Basic Instinct. And obviously there was your podcast.
Yep, guilty as charged. Put me in the cell, please.
Basic Instinct. It's a very good episode, by the way. There was only one other podcast that's kind of in my rotation that has covered this movie that I could find literally like 10 minutes before we sat down to record, because I had a quick look because I was curious. I kind of thought to myself, well, maybe other podcasts really aren't talking about this movie. And maybe we should talk about this movie because this is actually a bit of a powerhouse of a movie for so many reasons. But I kind of wanted to ask you, I guess, like what your history is with this movie. Like, I know you do briefly kind of go into it on your own episode about, when you first watched the movie and everything like that. But did you watch this movie in its original sexier cut, or did you, like me, watch the TV cut with no sex and no violence?
Well, I watched the original cut. It was on Sky, and unfortunately, I was fortunate enough to be able to access Sky. And my father is full-blown Greek. His English is a second language. Movies to him are, frivolous things that don't really mean a great deal and shouldn't have any kind of influence on a young, growing boy. So for him, it was like, well, if you want to watch something, you can just crack on. Don't worry about it. So I watched Basic Instinct when it, probably maybe a couple of years after it came out. Way too young, must I add. But I'm also a huge Michael Douglas fan, and I will explain my Michael Douglas fandom probably later on. So it's something I saw early, and then, transporting myself into my sort of late teenage years, going into film school in Leeds. For me, Basic Instinct is like the gateway drug to erotic thrillers. Yes, that's obvious. But also, if you are somebody who struggles with films that are a bit older, slower paced, probably slightly still photography, this is your gateway drug into Hitchcock. Any of Alfred Hitchcock's oeuvre, then just watch Basic Instinct because the references come thick and fast. So if you want a little bit of Vertigo, if you want a bit of The Fourth Man, or actually The Fourth Man's someone else, but if you want Rear Window, then watch Basic Instinct, because this is essentially Hitchcock movie made by a contemporary, well, at the time, a contemporary filmmaker in Paul Verhoeven. You know, it starts with the opening credits, Sam. You must have noticed the Saul Bass opening credits, graphic design, Jerry Goldsmith music. And it doesn't stop there, you know. Look at Catherine Trammell's costume design. Looks like Kim Novak, doesn't it? So, yeah, there's lots of that. So that's my history with it. And I picked it on the show, our show, because I know that one of my co-hosts, Devlin, is a sordid little soul. And Matt, who is one of our other co-hosts, had never seen it. So it was one of those exciting moments when you could introduce a movie to somebody who had never seen it. And you knew that it was probably going to elicit a response. And it did.
Yeah. It's interesting because I don't think I've seen this movie since I was like maybe about 17. And I remember watching it on TV, and it was one of the very heavily cut down TV versions with no graphic sex, like maybe a bit of kissing alluding to, you know, a bit of sex, but nothing like the full version that I managed to catch on Amazon Prime. And, you know, it's like it was heavily cut. So when I watched it at the weekend just gone this time around, I mean, obviously it was quite a little bit, you know, more graphic than I remembered. But then I realised I didn't actually remember that much of the plot either, because, you know, none of us are 17 anymore. You know, it's shameful to say, but it's true. Because this movie is so well known and infamous for certain scenes, I feel like those scenes have kind of overshadowed the movie quite a lot, sort of in the general lexicon of anyone talking about, you know, neo-noir thrillers, for example. They always kind of say, oh, Basic Instinct, it's the one with, you know, the opening of the legs. And that's kind of the only thing that ever gets talked about. But boy, is this movie so much more than just that one scene.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's really what I want to talk to you about, because I found it absolutely fascinating to rewatch the proper version of this movie so many years later, and just how intriguing it was, you know, from the point of view of it's so overshadowed by one scene that's basically become so immortalized in cinema history, so replicated. And
it's a pop culture moment, isn't it? Because I remember, is it Deadpool? Does it? Is it the original?
Yes.
Well, I say the original Deadpool, but you know, when you're dragging a pop culture reference from 1992, you know it's ubiquitous. But you're right, absolutely. And actually, you know, one of the things that, you know, I'm not, clearly your audience is probably going to think, well, this guy's going to just say positive things. There are lots of problematic stuff within the movie, and it's not a 10 out of 10. However, it is more than just a gratuitous shot or a film with a series of sex scenes. I genuinely think that there is far more craftsmanship going on, and there's far more to unpack. It's loaded, absolutely loaded with hot topic discussion points. Not to mention, you know, Michael Douglas's character is just fascinating. And then you're not even touching upon, you know, Catherine Trammell, who is, you know, in my opinion, she's up there with, you know, it's controversial, but she's up there with Ellen Ripley as far as strong female characters. You know, they don't necessarily always need to be heroes to be strong. She's a force of nature in this movie, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. It's interesting, actually, because as we're recording today, your podcast has actually just released an episode on RoboCop.
Yeah.
Which was obviously one of the preceding Paul Verhoeven movies. And obviously to this point, you know, just before Basic Instinct, he'd obviously had a career like in Europe, and he'd moved over to America. But he's mostly known for, at this point, RoboCop and Total Recall, which probably are two of his best movies. And it's a very interesting shift, I think, to go from, you know, the futuristic satire, the Philip K. Dick of Total Recall, to go to something like Basic Instinct, and obviously 3 years later to go to a movie that we watched together as part of the lockdown movie club that we did, Showgirls.
Yeah, don't forget your tomato ketchup, Pam. Don't forget that.
I just find this movie really fascinating. You obviously mentioned earlier about Michael Douglas. So what is it about Michael Douglas that you love so much. Obviously, he's done quite a few erotic thrillers.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
in his career. But yeah, what is it about Michael Douglas for you? And do you like the green V-neck sweater? That's a very important question.
Well, let me try and pull back some credibility. The V-neck is too deep. He's too old to pull that V-neck off. You know, that is something that only someone in their 20s with incredible pectorals could possibly pull off. And in that nightclub, I mean, really, he must be sweating. I mean, it looked like it was merino wool, which meant that he was very hot. So I would have suggested that was a bad choice. Not to mention, I think he's wearing Levi's washed denim, which, you know, you talk about middle-age alert. But
yeah,
anyway.
He basically looks like he's someone's dad come to pick up his
absolutely
kid
in the
from a
sexiest club possible, where everyone dances in a gyrating motion. There's no way he's able to, you know, keep up with Roxy and Catherine in those jeans and that jumper. But yeah, in fact, I read an interview in preparation for this. I didn't mention it on our show, but the costume designer even conceded that the V-neck was a poor choice without a t-shirt underneath. Her reasoning behind it was that she wanted Catherine to be able to touch him and touch his skin without, you know, any barrier. So it was a deep V, and it very much is a deep V. But anyway, as far as my kind of like adoration for Michael Douglas, nepotism is alive and well in the film industry, and it's not just in front of the camera. You know, it's behind the camera as well. And I've seen that in my time working in film and television. Douglas has got like an A-list, a Hollywood A-lister for a father, Spartacus himself. And I love the fact that he decided to not take the easy route. You know, he could have easily become like a conventional leading man. But instead, it's this only my opinion, but for me, he kind of shaped the way we see men, and in particular toxic masculinity, through the 80s and 90s. And I wondered if you kind of agreed with me on that one. If you think about his performances in something like Wall Street or Fatal Attraction, in Basic Instinct, and then subsequently in Falling Down, and then even going, you know, way into the 2000s, something like Wonder Boys, which no one has ever seen but me, and now Devlin, because I made him watch it for the show. No, I think he depicts different aspects of toxic masculinity without falling into the trappings of like villainy. It's way more nuanced than that. You know, he's got like a natural charm, a natural charisma, which means that weirdly, despite him playing these complicated characters that are deeply flawed, and that are deeply, you know, in most cases, he is in the wrong. You know, in this movie, he's a terrible detective. He treats Beth with contempt almost. It's it's not a simple relationship. He's clearly an addict, you know, a sex addict, a drug addict, an addict in every sense. But we somehow fall into the traps of kind of rooting for him, despite him being, you know, our quote unquote hero. And I think that is more of an accurate depiction of the complications and contradictions at play with, you know, men, and most importantly, kind of men who have, you know, power and influence, and certainly in the 80s and 90s. So for me, it was like an easy trajectory to go from like a Michael Douglas to bum, 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 you're going to love this, to kind of like a Keanu Reeves being our kind of our hero, you know, the Arnies. It's not to say that I don't love Arnold, but your Arnies and your Stallones of the kind of powerhouse, muscle-bound 80s types, that transition, you know, as certainly me as a younger viewer, I found that, you know, I shouldn't have been watching those Douglas movies, but in a way it taught me like the trappings of being a, you know, a good guy, but secretly, or not even secretly, nakedly, you're not really that good. And, you know, Douglas's character in this movie is he a good guy? And I wanted to ask you, like, do you think that, are you rooting for Michael Douglas at the end? Like, are you?
No.
And that is exactly what should be happening. But clearly, audience members were in on it. You know, look at the returns for this movie, and you're right. This is the zenith of erotic thrillers. Like, I don't think it gets as big as this. You can argue whether or not it gets as good, but I don't think it gets as popular and as big.
No. It's interesting that you mention, the toxic masculinity and the underlying toxic masculinity of his characters, because I recently did an episode on Romancing the Stone and the Jewel of the Nile. And I remember rewatching those movies because I love those movies.
He's a jerk in them, though,
especially
isn't he?
Romancing the Stone.
He's an arse.
But
yeah, right.
He is an absolute jerk. When Kathleen Turner's character is basically like, oh, I just need some help. Like, can you help me? And she basically offers him money. And, he's like, I'll do it for $500. And it's like $500 to take her to a phone box or something ridiculous. I didn't mention it too much in the episode, to be honest, because it was only a short episode. But I do kind of understand what you're saying about there's like a gritty realism often to Michael Douglas and what he puts out, in that he is expected to be this suave leading man, this attractive man that all the women can swoon over and all of that. But underneath that layer, there does seem to be that kind of very typical, like, 80s macho, you have to be strong, you have to, treat your woman mean to keep them keen kind of guy. And it's quite interesting, really, because, obviously you mentioned Keanu Reeves, and I'm very glad that you did, because he and the characters he portrays don't kind of go in for that. And that's obviously, I think, more of like a modern sensibility when it comes to the portrayal of men in cinema. But I just think it's really interesting that you've kind of picked up on the Michael Douglas of it all in this movie, and obviously in his other movies as well. Because my main focus in this movie was never Michael Douglas. Even though, like, he's first billed, and this is basically a movie that has been made on the power of his name and his name alone. And he obviously wanted someone to come on board to share that responsibility of this, erotic thriller having like two big names on the poster. And it's literally his name and then a virtual unknown who, in my opinion, absolutely obliterates everyone else in this movie with her performance.
She steals the film. And in fact, steal makes it sound like it was some kind of, there was a theft at play. No, she is I said a force of nature. And actually, one of the things that we always focus on the show is character introductions. And I find that Catherine Tremel's introduction, it couldn't be more apt. Like, she's on like a balcony overlooking the cliffs, and what are the waves doing? They're smashing into the cliffs. Like, we know that when Douglas encounters Catherine Tremel at the start of this movie, he's in for choppy waters. It's not particularly subtle, but my God, she's just great in this. And part of it is because she's so dangerous, like cold, calculated, beautiful, but everything she says, there is just a weight behind it. And, you get the sense that she is always the smartest person in the room. And it's a character attribute that I always apply to Lieutenant or Warrant Officer, depends on which movie. Ellen Ripley, it's the same that I apply to Catherine Tremel. Manipulative, yes. But in this instance, in Basic Instinct, what I love about her character is that, and this is what it's my opinion, but I think the movie, and I think Verhoeven, and, we can talk about Joe Esterhazy, also rhymes with house, if you want it to make it that way. Not a particularly nice guy, nor is probably Paul Verhoeven, somebody who's a controversial figure, certainly a provocateur as a filmmaker. But I think they are playing with gender norms, and Catherine Tremel displays the characteristics of a normal, powerful man, but she's not a man. She's a femme fatale, and she is the strongest character on screen at all times. And that's something that I deeply respect about the movie, and something that gets lost in the background noise of, the crossing leg scene.
Absolutely. That was one of the things that I think blew me away on the rewatch. It wasn't so much, there's a hell of a lot of sex in this movie, because there is a hell of a lot of sex, but I forgot how good she was. And I feel like every other role that she subsequently has had in her career has never matched up to what she does in this movie. And I think you're absolutely right with what you said. She is the smartest person in the room, in every single room that she's ever in. She's in that interrogation room with, I'm going to say 6. I think it's 6 men. and she outsmarts every single one of them. She knows how to flick Michael Douglas's character's switch, like immediately. She knows how to get at him. You know, she mentions about, you know, do you want a cigarette? And he's like, oh, I quit. And she's like, well, that's not going to last. And, you know, it's like she just knows who this person is immediately. And it all adds to like this mystique around her and around the whole, you know, did she kill her boyfriend? Everything that she says, she's so convincing. And I think that's what the interesting thing is that if I was a detective, which thank everyone in the UK that I'm not, because I think I'd be rubbish, but if I was, I would not be able to say that she wasn't telling the truth, because she is completely convincing in her arguments. I just think she's absolutely tremendous in this movie. And it's almost like, you know, that particular scene that obviously we will come to a bit later has just completely overshadowed an absolute powerhouse performance that is literally the greatest thing she's ever done. But again, it's like she's only ever remembered for the leg crossing. And that actually makes me a bit mad. Because
I don't know about that, Emma. I would say that she's great in Casino. You know, Casino not being one of Martin Scorsese's best works. You know, for many people, it's kind of like a rehash of Goodfellas. But she's the best thing in Casino. It's, you know, she's dialed up to 11. But you're right. This is, you know, when all things are said and done, she'll be remembered for this role. But this character is also unique in, you know, this was made in 1992. And I'm not sure we've had too many characters that are popped, female characters that are popped like Catherine Tremell. And when they did the sequel, I mean, the least said the better. It luckily, I think people have forgotten, so it won't sully the legacy of this of the character really. And I think that's one of the things is that I'm attracted to, is that for all of the controversies, all the problematic stuff that's contained within this film, is that the big takeaway that I have is, God, you don't see many Catherine Tremells on the big screen, and you certainly don't see too many Catherine Tremells go up against like a big A-lister and, you know, completely outsmart them. I mean, I say you're saying you couldn't be a detective. I think you could be a detective in 1992 in San Francisco, because old Nick Curran he's not the sharpest ice pick in the drawer, is he?
I think he's mostly being led by his other brain.
He's afflicted, yes, we all are.
Yeah. I do think you're right. Women don't often get roles like this. And if they do, they are very kind of cardboard cutout. Oh, you're going to be the sexy wife, or, you know, the mistress, or, you know, that sort of thing. And they're not given any kind of real agency and personality. I just feel like she takes every single line and she kind of adds something else to the way that line is delivered, whether that's like a little bit of malice or a little bit of intent or a little bit of flirty. You know, she just has this in her.
I will have my 2 cents rant about sex in cinema and generally the kind of the demise of the erotic thriller, because I do think there is a place for them. It's not just a titillation, because if it were, then are you happy for me to just go on just a slight tangent about sex in cinema? Yes. I think it's important because for those listeners who are likely like, yeah, I've heard of Basic Instinct, and it's that silly sex film with Sharon Stone where she uncrosses her legs and we see it's like Patrick Stewart in Extras. We see everything, but actually it's more than that. So Orson Welles famously said, there are only 2 things that cinema cannot depict honestly, which are prayer and sex, right? So Adrian Lyne, director of Fatal Attraction, said that any sex scene shown on screen is inherently funny, which I do believe in, because they always are, because it's like 2 people writhing around, you know, you can only make it funnier if you make them have sex on a waterbed. So he always made them purposely kind of outlandish. So if you ever watch Fatal Attraction, There's a bit where Michael Douglas and Glenn Close have sex and then there's a sink and they turn the tap on. It's ridiculous. But that was his point, was like, well, there's no way of making this sexy because sex scenes in movies just inherently aren't going to get you aroused. Maybe some people, but most people will be like, that's not how you do it. So he runs the tap. In this, if it was just sex scenes for sex scenes' sake, then it wouldn't have lasted and it wouldn't have transcended and it wouldn't have been as popular. I always look at like sex scenes as being opportunities to tackle real taboos. So like when the Hays Code came in like the 40s and 50s, and when it got released, interracial sex was something that, was actually banned. You couldn't do it. So a sex scene can do that. It can tackle a taboo. It can make it kind of normative and something that you just think, well, that's just normal. Same with gay sex. Basic Instinct, I think, is more than just a sex scene. So there's three, isn't there? So we have the murder at the beginning, which, clearly that's just your stinger. And I think Verhoeven's treating that like an action scene. If you think about an action movie, you want a big action film, right? A big action scene right at the beginning of the movie, and then you'll settle into the movie and you'll go, well, okay, I'll give you 30 minutes before the next sex scene. I think that's what he's doing. You have the big murder at the beginning. Obviously, it's also your point of interest. You've got the questionable rough sex / date rape, which I'm sure we'll talk about, with Nick and Beth. And then you've got the big sex scene between Catherine and Nick. And I'm wondering what you thought. Did you fear, I know you don't care about Nick because you've already said that you weren't like, I hope Nick Curran gets out of this one alive. But were you fearing for Michael in that point? I know you might have been looking at the timestamp and saying, well, there's definitely another 45 minutes of movie left, so I don't think he's going to get, quite killed just yet. But what was your reaction? Because Verhoeven shoots it like an action film. You see it from several different angles. It's massively choreographed. But I find that whole scene just so loaded with subtext. There's power, domination, there's gender roles being swapped, and there's also just Michael Douglas, not to get crude, listeners, but he's also just properly just going for the nipple, which is also quite fun. I am also quite silly. I'm not so serious all the time. What did you think, Em, during that scene?
So I found that actually quite fascinating, because I agree with you in that I think that Verhoeven does kind of film that like an action scene, because it's got like that kind of standard action build-up. You don't just go into an action scene and just get action straight away. There's always like a build-up to the big action scene. And obviously, at that point in the movie, you're a little bit like, well, is she the murderer? Is she not the murderer? The movie obviously does its best to put a lot of like red herrings in there. And yeah, I do want to talk about the scene between him and Beth, just on a separate note. We can do that in a little bit. But I always find sex scenes quite interesting in that usually, and I think this is kind of what you were alluding to earlier, is that usually they feel like they're shot from a male perspective. So like very male gazing. Mm-hmm. So, you'll have a shot of like the beautiful woman, but it will be shot in very much like a male gaze. The woman will give pleasure to the man and is like expected to be pleasuring the man and all of that sort of stuff. And the sex is always, in most movies, kind of aimed more towards the man being the more satisfied party, shall we say. But what I really loved about this is that is more focused on Catherine, and it's Catherine who's calling the shots, and it's Catherine who seems to be getting the most pleasure. And the movie is quite smart, really, because it's like, is she getting sexual pleasure, or is she getting pleasure knowing that she could murder this person? And, when she does the little reach, and you think she might be reaching for something under the covers. Like you say, when you've got 40 minutes left on a Michael Douglas starring movie, it's highly unlikely that he's going to meet his demise. But
the ending leaves it
that's...
open though, Em, right? You know?
Yeah, it does.
It's a great little
And I love
it's a
that.
great little hook. I mean, don't get me wrong, his fate is sealed from the moment he meets. You know that he's doomed.
Yes.
One of the things that I love about a character is that all the normal things that you would associate with a motivation for a femme fatale, so whether that be, you know, a love for another man or money, normally the big motivator. You know, anyone who's ever watched Columbo, I'm a huge Columbo fan, it's always about money. Catherine Trammell is wealthy and doesn't need it. And she says it outright, like when she has sex with the rock star, it's because he gave her pleasure. It's got nothing to do with anything else. And I find that like very, very interesting because we just don't, there's a nakedness to her motivation, which is that she doesn't have any. And that's the thing that scares everyone around them. You know, I think Verhoeven, this isn't to excuse him because he's, like I say, he's a controversial character. All of his movies, you know, we've just done RoboCop and there's some problematic stuff in that too. But one of the things he does is he pushes the envelope constantly. So you have to have that discussion. And one of the things that in Basic Instinct that you see is, you know, what if a female had all the male characteristics that we associate, you know, somebody who is a predator, whose eyes always look forward, who goes after their prey and is callous and cold and doesn't really actually care. You know, her relationship with Roxy, I know that caused a lot of uproar at the time, and I can imagine reading it on the page, but the way that Verhoeven depicts it, she is just another pawn in Catherine's game. That's how I see it anyway. Obviously, I'm not making excuses. I'm just saying from my perspective, when I watch the movie, I don't see characters of sexual orientation or gender being demeaned or a kind of misogynistic viewpoint. I see somebody who's trying to push the envelope to make sure that the biggest character in the movie, which is Catherine, everyone understands it's her game and we're all just pawns in it. And that's how I see it.
Yeah, can I ask, you know, the scene specifically with Catherine, she gets very emotional when Roxy dies, and she alludes to the fact that everyone she gets close to dies, and that's why she doesn't want to get close to anyone. Do you feel like that is genuine emotion, or do you feel like that's part of her game?
I think that's genuine because I'm not sure it wasn't part of the plan. I don't think that Roxy would... I think she's manipulating her just like she's manipulating everyone. And, you know, we can get into the Beth doppelganger, red herring misdirection. I think it is misdirection. I think she gets her hooks into you. And then once she does, you are a slave in a way. You will... The way that Douglas kind of falls under her spell and suddenly, you know, the sun just shines through it, like out of her arse. He'll not even entertain the idea that she's actually the killer. And he has such an interesting arc. If you think about it, he's somebody who is similar to Catherine. He's self-serving. He's somebody who will fall into his own addictions, and he'll not fight against them. But he is trying to fight against them. He's trying to stop smoking. He's trying to stop drinking. And I think that's the relationship with Beth, is that's conventional relationships. But as soon as Catherine comes along, he gets a taste of what he's really all about, which is this incredible kind of sexual chemistry. You know, it's one of the funniest lines of the movie. It's like of the century or something like that. And then in the end, he actually succumbs to this idea that, you know, we'll have little rugrats and we'll go away and have happy families. And she's like, absolutely not, Nick. You are literally
that probably seals his fate.
You are part of, you know, the next book, and you were always part of the next book. And that's, yeah, I just like the way that comes around at the end. Obviously it's left at a cliffhanger, but I think we all know that Nick Curran is not for the sequel.
No. And I was obviously going to mention a sequel. You did mention it briefly earlier, but I have no intention of watching that.
No,
I'll be completely honest.
No, don't watch it. Normally, you know me, I'm all for a bit of, a good thick slice of trash, but genuinely, there's no nutritional value in watching it. It came too late. It was written. They don't do anything to advance the character. It's cheaply made. It looks cheap. It feels cheap. Everyone in it feels ashamed to be in it. It's best to just kind of leave that in the, well, speaking of Verhoeven, in the RoboCop remake and the Total Recall remake, they never really happened. So that's fine. You just carry on.
Yeah, that's harsh. Can we just briefly talk about the sex scene between Nick and Beth?
Mm-hmm.
Because that was the one moment in the movie that made me feel genuinely uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That obviously it was one of those scenes that the TV edit didn't really contain in its fullness. And I just had a genuine discomfort watching it.
What was your reading, Em? What did you think was going on? Like, what's happening? What's the dynamic between the characters? I'm interested in knowing what you think, because I've got my opinions, but I genuinely want to know what you think, because, as I say, it's one of the things that we don't have on our show, which is a kind of female perspective on these things.
I mean, the first thing that I picked up on is he's obviously got this kind of very sexual attraction to this other woman, Catherine Trammell. But he's kind of seeing this girl, Beth, on and off.
Mm-hmm.
So he's maybe got a bit of pent-up frustration or something. I don't know. I don't even know why I'm trying to, make excuses for this character. But they obviously start getting down to it. And at first, she seems quite into it, but he's obviously quite rough. And it's obviously something that she's not particularly used to, because maybe their relationship, we don't obviously see it, but maybe their relationship is, a little bit more vanilla in the bedroom, shall we say.
Yep.
And you can see a moment where Jean Triplehorn just kind of switches and she's just like, no. And, she from memory, she repeats the word no. And he carries on. And obviously at that point, I was like, I don't like this, because he's obviously being very forceful. He's at that point ripping her clothes and, bending her over I'm going to say it's a table, but I can't remember very well from memory. And I only watched it a week ago and I can't remember. But yeah, she basically gets bent over something and all the time she's saying no. And then she kind of gets to a point where she seems okay with it. But for me, as a viewer and as a female viewer, well, no means no. Let's make that perfectly clear. If someone doesn't want something, the first time they say no is the time that you stop. I just wonder if the movie is kind of sending a very specific message that I'm not completely comfortable with. That if a girl or a man or woman, if they're up for it, but then they're not up for it for whatever reason, that it's okay to continue. And that made me feel very uncomfortable. And then it's like, she's not okay to continue. She says no, but then, she got into it, so it's okay. I was not particularly happy. I feel like it sends a message to perhaps the kind of young men that you were talking about, the young men who have been brought up on this kind of toxic masculinity and, no probably doesn't mean no, it might mean maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But so if I just carry on, then she'll say yes eventually. And that's not right,
No.
So I'm curious as to your point of view on it, sort of from a male perspective, but from a female perspective, from my female perspective, I was not happy with that scene. I was not happy with the ending of that scene. When she says, you were never like that before, all of that. It's fine to want to explore your sexuality and you might want to, I don't know, have some consensual rough sex with your partner. That's absolutely fine. But it has to be consensual.
Yeah.
And both parties have to agree to that. And she agreed up to a point, then she disagreed, but he carried on anyway. And then she was like, oh, okay, well, might as well carry on then.
No, I think it's important to preface that I personally think that Paul Verhoeven knows exactly what he's doing. He's a very smart filmmaker. He's got a PhD in mathematics and physics, not necessarily equate to a kind of high level of emotional intelligence, but it does mean that he is, he's academic. He's somebody who is able to run the numbers, shall we say. I don't necessarily understand fully, because I'm definitely not smart enough to understand the full intent of the scene, but I think he shoots it in a way that is deeply ambiguous, and that is where the problem comes. So we're not entirely sure, and I agree, I felt exactly the same way. We're not sure if it's consensual, we're not sure if it's role-playing, we're not sure if it's a rape. And there's definitely a disconnect between Nick and Beth in the sequence. The thing that always draws my eye is in the background, I don't know if you noticed, but there's like a Jane Fonda exercise class going on across the street. If I'm not suggesting you go back and watch the scene again, because it is a deeply uncomfortable one. But if you ever catch yourself watching it again, have a look in the background. Done on purpose. I don't know exactly what he's trying to drive at. I saw it as like the banality of life. If you think about, as I was saying, that sex scenes for just eroticism on their own, they fall by the wayside. If the day the internet comes alive is the day that these movies that just do sex scenes for sex scenes' sake cease to contain any kind of meaning. This, I think, is really about Nick, not necessarily about Beth, which again makes the scene uncomfortable. He's just had several encounters. He's just encountered Catherine. That's kind of triggered the old version of himself, when I was saying before about this kind of conventionality. I think that's what the scene is about. Beth represents like a normal, structured relationship where he doesn't smoke, he doesn't drink. He's a quote unquote like a good guy. Catherine kind of brings out that, get out Peter Griffin basic instinct in him. Now this, this is like kind of low level reading, but this is how I see the scene. But I'm 100% with you, because it really is just an uncomfortable watch. But knowing Verhoeven as I don't, I think it's on purpose. Similar. I had a similar reaction reviewing RoboCop recently with the Murphy crucifixion / execution sequence, and actually Matt, who's on the show, described it in a way as like a date rape. It was done in a way where there was a humiliation, the way that Murphy gets killed by the gang members. And in a way, I think Verhoeven, and he is a provocateur, and that's not to excuse it, because I do think it's deeply problematic. And rightfully, as a disclaimer for anyone who is listening to this, who wants to, heeds my advice, or if you are championing the movie to rewatch it, huge disclaimer: be aware there will be sequences that will cause distress, and that is definitely one of them. 100% agree.
It's probably the most opportune segue we're going to get, so I'm going to use it. So we're going from a very controversial scene to another very controversial scene, but we've obviously talked a little bit about the scene in which Sharon Stone, as Catherine Trammell, uncrosses her legs. She happens to not be wearing any underwear, and the camera is pointed directly at her crotch. And so you see her intimate lady parts, shall we say. Mm-hmm. It is probably one of the most iconic scenes in cinema history. And recently, Sharon Stone has actually come out to say that she was wearing underwear originally for the scene, and that Verhoeven asked her to take it off because it was white and it was causing a glare on the camera. And she claims that she didn't realise that the camera was at a point where it could see her lady garden, and ultimately she didn't consent to having her private parts shown. And as iconic as that scene is, I feel like knowing that has also made me feel a bit uncomfortable retrospectively about that scene in particular, because obviously Verhoeven's basically denied what Stone has said. He claims that she did know that the camera was there, that it would pick up her private area. And obviously there's differing accounts of what went down. I feel like, you know, in this scenario, it's more important to believe the woman in the situation when she is a young actress. You know, this is her breakout role. And maybe she genuinely didn't know that this was happening at the time. And reportedly, she didn't realise until she saw the screening that had happened. And obviously what that potentially could do to a blossoming career in the film industry. You know, she's already appeared in this movie several times nude, because obviously no body doubles were used in this movie. So she's appeared nude in her breakthrough role, and she's also had her private parts basically shown to millions upon millions of people. It's kind of an interesting thing to discuss, really, when we are talking about such an iconic scene, and when something does come out retrospectively that maybe taints that scene. Do you feel like that taints the movie somewhat to know that maybe she didn't give her full consent at the time? There's such a huge power dynamic in that scene where Catherine Trammell has all of the power in the room, she has all of the intelligence in the room, and the scene is about so much more than the legs being uncrossed, and yet that's the bit that we focus on. And is it just something to do with, I don't know, the repressed sexual nature of Hollywood cinema, and people just aren't used to scenes like that, and that's why we focus on it so much?
I think, one, it exposes the double standards of just cinema and the way that we respond to the human body. You know, God forbid you show a pee, because everyone will lose their mind. But hey, it's okay if you show a V. That does appear to be still something of a mindset. I mean, could you imagine if, I don't know, Captain America got his willy out? People go crazy, you know. So there's definitely something about that, and you know, that's not me trying to sort of jump on the bandwagon against kind of American conservatism. I think here in Britain, we've also got a little bit of a kind of an issue when it comes down to kind of an openness about sexuality, about our private parts, about even discussing that kind of stuff. You know, it's always slightly taboo. In this situation, can I say neither? I think, one, I think it's abhorrent that there was no, that, you know, I believe Sharon Stone, that there was no consent. I would see no reason why she would say that, you know, 20 years removed. And you could, you know, with everything that's going on, you know, since the rise of the Me Too movement, I think you can absolutely believe that was a thing that happened in 1992 on a Paul Verhoeven set. You know, that's not to denigrate the individual, because we don't know the true story. So I will pull the splinter out of my bum and say, we don't know what happened, but if it were, you know, I believe Sharon Stone, and I don't think it was consensual, and that is wrong. What I do think, though, is that I listened to an interview with Paul Verhoeven. He was talking about how, you know, men uncross their legs, open their legs, and then cross them again. So his point of view was, I'm gonna again give her male characteristics. She's gonna, you know, she is the strongest person in the room at that point. She's manipulating everybody in that interrogation scene. You know, just look at the fallacy of the interrogation scene itself. You know, I'm not a policeman, but I know that you don't conduct interviews with 6-7 people in a room all sat across. You know, it's fiction, it's stylized, but my God, does it work for the scene? And that doesn't necessarily justify the means, but it is an iconic shot in cinema. And I do think that you don't know sometimes how these things come about, but, you know, as I say, if it's being parodied in Deadpool 30 years later, then it made an impression. But yeah, I think on set, you would like to have thought that somebody would have spoken to the actor and said, are you happy that you know, and let's not forget as well, in 92, you know, they are not thinking that 4K restorations will be a thing. But again, it doesn't justify it. You know, it's wrong on all accounts. But I guess my point is that the movie is more than just that controversy. But you a bit like the scene with Beth. If you're coming into it, you need to be aware of it. Yeah, I'm thinking about when we watched Showgirls on our watch along, and I'd even forgotten about the second to last scene in Showgirls, which is, we're not going to get into it, but it's an absolute buzzkill, right? Like we were having such a fun time, and I forgot about the second to last scene. I think if you're a Paul Verhoeven fan, then I think you know what you're getting into. If you don't know what his movies are like, then it will come as a surprise, and it will likely be a barrier to entry. So I think just like with the scene with Beth, I think it's important to know that there's ambiguity around it. And if you're comfortable with that, then I think you can still enjoy the ride. If you're not comfortable with it, then quite frankly, you should just leave Basic Instinct on the shelf.
Yeah, I think that's a fair thing to say, because as enjoyable as this movie is and was, the fact it is technically classed as an erotic thriller, I mean, that doesn't mean that it's, especially erotic.
No, because, I don't think it is. I mean, did you genuinely? Did you find it to be, I don't know where you watched it with, or if you watched it on your own, but I don't think this would be like, if you're going to a marriage counselling, they would be like, you know what you need to do, Saturday night, get a bottle of red wine and get Basic Instinct on whatever streaming service you wish, and all things will be resolved. I don't, it's, for me, the movie's strength is not in the eroticism. The movie's strength is in the way that they, I for example, the whodunit of it all is the weakest aspect of the movie. I don't ever question that it was Catherine all along, and I don't think necessarily the film is trying to even play that game. This isn't Scream where we've got a multitude of suspects. There's a small cast of characters. It can only really be one of two people, really. And if you watch the opening sequence, the opening murder, it really can only be Catherine and Beth. And I'm not sure that Beth is, she's a patsy. She's being manipulated just like everyone else. I don't think we'll say Roxy as well. Okay, one of three, considering the body type, etc. So if you're watching this with a Columbo perspective, this is not the movie for you. It is literally a pulp novel premise that is super rote, a detective story that is not really about a detective story. It's really about two people that have got an addiction. One who is super in control of it and is able to wield it, and the other who is flying. They don't call him Shooter for nothing. All right, that's what I'm saying now. So there we go.
Just quickly on the Beth front, because the movie does try to frame Beth on several occasions to make you think it could be her. I'm thinking of when she emerges from the staircase and there happens to be a blonde wig and an ice pick found on the stairs and she gets shot, and, spoilers for a movie that's 30 years old. But the other thing that's really interesting is she's having a conversation when they leave the station, and she basically goes to her car and she's all smiley and happy, and Douglas's character basically goes back in. He is absolutely relieved that she's okay with everything.
Like, again, just the perfect depiction of like toxic masculinity. Oh, right. Okay. Me being an arse. It's okay with you? That's great. Okay. I'll see you later, Beth. Take it. I'm really glad that you're like comfortable with me being, super kind of jerky. But yeah, she makes a look and the camera stays on her.
So it's like you kind of have this idea that maybe she is like this sweet innocent girl, she's just mixed up, she actually really likes this guy, but then she has that smile, and then as soon as he turns, it just changes. And the movie does it on purpose. It absolutely does it on purpose to make you think that she could be the criminal mastermind.
There's another one. When Ned Ryerson, there's a deep cut from Groundhog Day, who's playing like some pseudo psychiatrist about the book. It's really early on in the movie. Instead of selling insurance, he's selling like psychological profiles on serial killers. He says something like, she's using this as an alibi. If it's not her doing the murder and trying to cover her own tracks, then it's someone copycatting. He says something like, if that's the case, then it is someone who is deeply disturbed. Edit point, we cut to Beth, who kind of shoots a look. It's not rocket science. It's kind of, movie framing 101. But I think the way that Verhoeven shoots it, you could easily make a case for Beth being the single white female type who's gone a bit crazy because she fell in love with Catherine and loves Shooter and doesn't want her man to be taken. But I think if you're going down that route, then that's the super reductive theory. It's Catherine all along. She's covered her tracks too well, even if we discount the fact that, dino DNA didn't exist in 1992.
Well, I mean, I know we don't really have a great deal of time to go into DNA evidence, but they were using DNA in 1992, so, but the movie would have been over in 5 minutes, so... It
would have been. And then, again, this makes me sound like I'm making excuses for the movie. It's just not about that. Like, again, if you're into... If you watch Zodiac, and you want to watch Zodiac again, but Zodiac with some sexy scenes, the Basic Instinct isn't for you. It's not... The whodunit is like the least important thing in the movie. It's really about how and why and the journey that Shooter goes on. In fact, the only scene that I still have yet to understand, and I think it's just Verhoeven just kind of with American culture and kind of almost with a Eurovision slant trying to, make some kind of point about the grotesque nature of these like deep South rubes, is the scene in the diner with his partner when he's got his cowboy hat on. He's just been taken away from his line dancing class and they're eating chili and he's talking about foreigners. It makes no sense whatsoever, apart from Verhoeven wants to make a point about Americans looking at foreigners in a disparaging way. It's got nothing to do with the film, but yeah, there you go.
I mean, that's kind of what I thought. It was like, oh, he's another racist cop.
Yeah.
Oh, yay. Yeah. There's not enough racist cops in the world.
Can I champion something then, though? Because I've talked about Hitchcock. And one of the things that I absolutely love, is because Death, the elevator, when he's in the elevator, and we know that the killer's on,
and it stops
on
at
the
each
floor.
floor. Yeah, that's really
that is
good.
just if you want to see a sequence, if you're not going to watch Basic Instinct in its totality, just watch that sequence. For that is how you ratchet up tension, keep suspense to its optimum, and then deliver. When the killer, whoever it may be, you decide, comes out. Spoilers, there is a killer, by the way. Yeah, that is just masterful stuff, because every time I watch that sequence, I'm just like, I know what's going to happen, but it gets me every time. So that to me is like, for all of his foibles, Verhoeven knows how to construct an effective sequence, for sure. And also, by the way, deep, Keanu obligatory reference, Jan de Bont. Do you reckon this was his like dry run for Speed? That's a hell of a car chase on the cliffs of San Francisco. No?
I mean, this is a beautiful looking movie. Obviously Speed, but also Basic Instinct. Some of the shots in this movie are absolutely gorgeous. Mm. And then it's like you realise it's Jan de Bont and you're like, I can kind of see that. Yeah, and obviously a couple of years later, he would do Speed with Keanu. So I mean, that's a pretty perfect obligatory Keanu.
He knows how to do a car chase.
I'll take it.
He knows how to do weather chasing people.
Yes.
He can't do haunted houses.
This has been a lot of fun, and I'm really glad that you chose Basic Instinct, not just because it's something that I would probably never do, but because you obviously have so much passion for it, but also, you clearly know what you're talking about when it comes to...
Have I turned you around, Am? Are you like, you know what? Basic Instinct. It's not problematic at all. No, it is super problematic.
Problem.
But I don't think it is... there is more to it than just the controversies that surround it. I saw some contemporary reviews that basically dismissed it as like, it hasn't aged well. I was like, well, God forbid you film something in a bubble. Like, of course it hasn't aged well, nor has, the Goonies. Yeah, there are lots of stuff that hasn't aged well, but there is value to be mined, and there's value in Basic Instinct, in my opinion.
Oh, absolutely. And to be honest, most of that value comes from Sharon Stone and just how incredible she is. But I'm just really pleased that we've been able to have like a conversation about it from, very different perspectives. You being a man and me being a woman. We are very different, and yet we are the same.
We are the same.
Just a huge thank you for coming on and for choosing Basic Instinct. Is basically the roundabout way that I'm getting to. And I mean, hopefully people who are listening, they've got something out of this conversation. I know I've got something out of this conversation. And that's basically, why I love listening to the Rewind Movie Podcast is I feel like I always get something out of the conversation that you guys have. So yeah, huge thanks for coming on. Obviously, feel free to plug whatever you want to plug. And where can listeners find you and find what you do?
Oh, thank you very much, Ab. Well, listen, firstly, thanks for having me. I hope that this has been enjoyable for you and listeners. I've thoroughly enjoyed myself. And thank you very much for kind of giving me your perspectives as well, because as I say, sometimes you can live in your own vacuum, can't you? And I'm just there writing my thoughts about a movie that, quite frankly, no one wants to have a conversation with me about. So lovely that you would allow me to do that. We've got a website. We're at the rewindmoviecast.com. Yeah, slight anomaly there because we're called the Rewind Movie Podcast, but wasn't the most original name when we came up with it. But I believe we're the top Google search if you type Rewind, but you will get like 100 other rewinds. But our logo is very distinctive, right, Em?
Yes.
We cover Basic Instinct. If you want to hear my thoughts and my gang's thoughts on Basic Instinct over 2 hours, it's essentially the length of the movie. That's episode 30, and we also do our own individual art. So if you want to purchase one of our portraits or are interested in our blogs, we do our own writing. It's all non-for-profit. We don't make any money off any of this, despite being badgered by people to turn on the monetization. We don't do any of that kind of stuff. So no, thank you very much, Em, for having us. And yeah, I hope that this is the start of a new sexy wave of diorama.
Maybe I should rebrand as like, I don't know, verbal sexual drama or something like that. Do the adult side.
Can I recommend for your movies? Can I recommend for your listeners? I said this is a gateway into the erotic thrillers. If you want just a genuine crazy time, go watch Bruce Willis's Color of Night. It forms part of the erotic thriller oeuvre. It's mad. It's absolutely mad. So yeah, we've covered it on the show. This is not a please listen to that episode either. This is a genuine appeal. Watch Basic Instinct. That will be like, ooh, well, this is actually an interesting genre. Then watch Color of Night. I guarantee it'll be the funniest film you've seen this year. 100%. And you get to see Bruce Willis's penis. So.
And who doesn't want to see some Bruce Willie? Yeah,
well, you almost went in there with Willie. Take away.
Do you know what? I was going to go Bruce Willis dong, and I was like, well, no, because my brain was like, no, it's in the name. It's in the name.
Yeah, it's they don't. The old phrase, they don't make films like that anymore. Let's just put it that way.
Okay, I don't know how important to me the idea of seeing Bruce Willis's man parts.
Well,
you'll notice as well.
You see it in Pulp Fiction, but in Color of Night, like
oh yeah, you do.
You see, like it's not just hidden behind a the kind of shower glass. It's there, looking at you, winking. Okay. So it's lovely.
Where is this going?
Nowhere good.
I'm going to keep all this in the episode. By the way,
nowhere good.
None of this is getting cut.
Well, thanks for having me, Em. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And, I'm looking forward to having you back on the show. Keep it sexy. That's the hashtag.
Keep it sexy. Thank thank you again to Gali for joining me for this episode on Basic Instinct. And thank you for listening too. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts on Basic Instinct. And if you do want to support this podcast without paying a single penny, you can help this podcast reach more listeners by leaving a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser or wherever you found this podcast. You can retweet or like posts on social media. I am at Verbal Diorama on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and Letterboxd. Or you can simply tell your friends and family about this podcast. So I want to talk about the next episode just quickly. It is the second episode of Auguest, and it's going to be the only returning guest for this season. And this is a man who loves the year 1999 so much that all of his guest spots so far, there have been 2 previous ones, have been on movies that came out in the year 1999. And this one is no exception. This episode on Basic Instinct was my first erotic thriller. And the next episode, would you believe it, is going to be my first Kevin Smith movie on Verbal Diorama. And not only that, my favourite Kevin Smith movie. You people, if there isn't a movie about it, it's not worth knowing, is it? So the returning guest is Andy from Geek Salad, of course, and the movie is Dogma. A controversial movie at the time, but one with a very simple message. It's not about who's right or wrong. No denominations nailed it yet, because they're all too self-righteous to realise that it doesn't matter what you have faith in, just that you have faith. Your hearts are in the right place, but your brain's got to wake up. So join me next week with returning guest Andy from Geek Salad as we talk about Dogma. So if you're interested in supporting this podcast financially, you can join the Patreon. You will get things like access to the schedule, early episodes, freebies, as well as this episode particularly. There are 3 swears in this episode that I've had to bleep out for regular listeners, but patrons, they get those swears. So Verbal Diorama Patreon episodes aren't just early, they are also expletive, but the main feed will always remain family friendly and suitable for all ages. So if you're interested, it's verbaldiorama.com/Patreon. Thank you to the patrons of Verbal Diorama, to Simon E, Sade, Claudia, Simon B, Laurel, Derek, Vern, Kristin, Kat, Andy, Mike, Griff, Luke, Emily, Michael, Scott, Brendan, Ian M, Lisa, Sam, Will, Jack, Dave, Chris, Stuart, Ian D, Jason, Sunny, Drew, Nicholas, Zoe, Kev, Pete and Heather. What are you going to do? Charge me with having patrons? We also have a merch store. It's verbaldiorama.com/merch. You can get in touch with me by emailing verbaldiorama@gmail.com. You can also pop over to my website, verbaldiorama.com, and you can also find me at filmstories.co.uk. You can find articles that I write and my magazine column as well. And finally,
Tell me, Nikki, were you frightened last night?
That's the point, wasn't it? That's what made it so good.
You shouldn't play this game.
Why not? I like it.
You're in over your head.
Maybe. But this is how I'll catch my killer.
Not gonna confess all my secrets, Nick, just because I have an orgasm. You won't learn anything I don't want you to know.
Yes, I will. And I'll nail you.
Nah. You'll just fall in love with me.
I'm in love with you already. But I'll nail you anyway. You can put that in your book.
bye.
Hey there, classmates. Tune in to Middle Class Film Class every Monday and Wednesday for weekly movie news, streaming picks, and one deep dive review.
The Batman trailer. There was a teaser, there was a trailer 1, trailer 2, final trailer. I don't know if it's the same one. How many trailers do we need exactly?
Leave an email or voicemail to join in the discussion.
Bullshit artist!
Yeah, buddy.
All
right.
Awesome. You're going full Danzig.
Right, I am. My trans
You have no power over me.